Yes.
So thank you, Riccardo, for coming, and let's see what the truth is for Riccardo.
Yeah. Thanks, Miro. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, indeed, I'm always very happy to being here in the mountains to take a break from Vienna. And yeah, as you were a bit saying, I also have this approach. I always tell my students never talk about truth. Truth is something which does not belong to what we do, and it does not interest us. It's something that has to do with religion, with moralism, with other things, but not with academic work. And even more so, my PhD that I discussed a couple of years ago was precisely, let's say, around this negation. No? So I did a PhD on the notion of the image, so in how to understand the notion of the image in architecture in information age. And the image, in that sense, was something that was, at least to a certain philosophical tradition, is exactly the opposite of truth, no? Because the image is not the original, is not the object, is a copy, and therefore is something that mystifies truth. And I was, with my PhD, was like, but what if the image comes first? What if, like in architecture, when we draw before realizing the object, so when let's say the drawing, the rendering, the image comes before the object itself and determines what the object will be, what if we take this paradigm for everything else? And this was the work I did in my PhD. But I'm not gonna talk about my PhD today. So today I took this chance. Let's say I always like to take opportunities of invitations such as this to kind of wander and get a bit lost and see what else could come out. And yeah, and then to approach perhaps more this topic, the one of truth. Try to speak of what is, to my understanding, unspeakable. And it was interesting to do so for me because, yeah, truth today seems not to be something objective, so not something as before it has to do with something impersonal, objective, something that maybe a scientific knowledge can attain, but seems to be something more subjective, something not public but private. Here I took one reference that I never worked with, so this is also the first time. So this is Ariana Grande and Lady Gaga that say that gotta live my truth. So what does it mean, my truth? No, so how can truth can be something, the property of someone? So truth is a property of someone, and is also social. So this is a screenshot from Truth Social. I guess you know what it is. Is this kind of social media that sprang with the new Republican Party in the U.S. So as a kind of alternative to Twitter and to media that used to be considered as dominated by the Democratic Party. And so one that would also, let's say, foster the notion of the so-called alternative facts, no? So also this idea that one can choose which truth to believe in, no? So you don't need, there's not a universal truth. You can choose which one to believe to, no? And here, for instance, we see Melinda's truths. She says simplicity is key, a good cut of beef, salt, pepper, and olive oil, and she does an Italian gesture, no? So this is a kind of truth that we have confronted also with today. And also what is kind of funny to me is that truth can have a temperature. There are hot truths, no? So, and this is often, let's say, foregrounded, or they say that belongs to a sphere that often fights, if you want, or often counters what is known to be the scientific discourse, no? So these are belongs to a sphere that, for instance, consider things like climate change an opinion and not a truth. It considers it alternative facts, so that puts into question these things. And in here, I'm not like taking sides on one and the other. I'm just like kind of trying to give a little painting of what might be today the condition of truth. And at the same time, this I don't think should surprise us as much, because science, as I was saying also before, never really claimed to be true or to have to possess truth. Quite the opposite. For instance, if you look at Popper, the idea of science in Popper is precisely the opposite. So science is not what is true, but what can be falsified. So what is true is rather a dogma, something that really belongs to religion, so something that cannot be questioned, something that cannot be proven false because we just accept it that it is. Whereas science is completely the opposite, because in science, scientific evidence must always be open, cannot never be closed. No, so we always need to improve, to progress, and to, we have like I don't know, Kepler, Galileo. So these paradigms always change. So it must be open to change. So there cannot be this kind of truth as a fixed certainty. And another thing that I always observe with a certain interest is that in the modern age, we don't really speak, or we don't speak as much as truth as we did in antiquity. So truth has largely been replaced by another word which was not really present in antiquity, which is the one of reality. That in German has a nice translation, Wirklichkeit, that relates to the etymology of work. So let's say reality is not just reality, but is reality because things there are effective, they work. No? So they are not imaginary, but they have an effect, so that we can feel their effects. And it's often, so the real is often, if you want, put into contrast with the imaginary, but also there are another interesting things happens. That is, in mathematics, for instance, we have the real and the imaginary are just two domains that are, let's say, they're not one is true and one is false, but they work together. No, so imaginary and real are not, if you want, antinomic, but they are domains that are both effective. No, they compose the complex numbers, and so they are both to that extent wirklich. No, they are both effective. So this was, let's say, a bit a sketch to let's say orient ourselves in what could be truth in the contemporary, and how we might, let's say, feel, how we might touch this concept today. So there are many lines to follow to discuss the idea of truth. But what I would like to do today is to follow one that is a bit more close to my interest and my work, and then that hopefully can also relate to what I guess we're all studying here, so architecture. What I always try to do with my work, so try to approach these philosophical concepts, but then say, okay, but what about architecture? And as I perhaps anticipated in the abstract, I want to start with a children's tale, the one of Christian Andersen's The Emperor's New Clothes, in which, if you don't know the story, there is a vain emperor or a vain king obsessed with fine garments, and he's tricked by two con artists who claim to weave an invisible fabric that only the wise can see. Eager to show off these new clothes, the emperor parades through the city wearing nothing at all, so being naked. And the townsfolk, so let's say the subject of this king, are afraid of appearing foolish, so they praise his attire, until a child innocently exclaims, "The king is naked." The tale, and this is what the ChatGPT summary of the tale says, highlights themes of vanity, deception, and the power of speaking truth. Now, the reason why I chose this, let's say, tale to kind of enter this discussion of truth is because I think it brings together three concepts that I think we could work with today. So one, of course, is truth, so this power of speaking truth. The other one is nakedness, or on the other side, clothing, so the new clothes of the emperor, or the fact that the emperor is naked. And the third one has to do with the child, so with infancy. But let's start from two of them, so by truth and nakedness. So the first relationship, let's say, that one could trace between these two concepts is, if you want, the Greek word for truth, or at least the word that in ancient Greek defined truth, which is aletheia. And aletheia does not just mean truth, but means truth in an interesting way. Aletheia literally means unveiling. So is a truth as a kind of getting naked, if you want, as a taking off the clothes or taking off the veil out of something. So today it's a bit strange because today we often say revelation, which means to cover again. The Greek would say unveil, so to make things naked. At the same time, Lethe is the name of the mythical river in which things were forgotten. So if you want, there are two meanings of this word. On one hand, we have the unveiling, and on the other one is a kind of remembering, which is not just remembering, but it's just like kind of unforgetting. So we have to not forget, so to let's say make a movement counter to forgetfulness. So We have veiling, concealing, forgetting. So truth is always kind of defined as a kind of negative to something else. And interesting is not a fact nor an object, so not a property nor an object nor a word, but it's kind of a movement. No? So it's a kind of an action that is performed. So it's not really truth, but as a kind of truthing, no, we could say today. And this action is something that has to happen in time. So in that sense, if you want truth in this paradigm, it's not something pornographic, so it's not something that manifests itself immediately, but it's more erotic. So there is a kind of eroticism in it. And coming back to this linkage between, let's say, nakedness and truth, one of the main examples that we can report is, of course, is a religion one, is the one of the Garden of Eden. And here in, let's say, in the illustration that comes originally from Lucas Cranach Sr., of which the painting is you can find it in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, that has been reused here for the opening titles of Desperate Housewife. And yeah, the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, they are, of course, naked, so they don't have clothes. The human is here in its, if you want, original form, so in its true form, naked, without clothes. I mean, they have these leaves, but in principle, they don't need clothes because they are in paradise. No, there's no necessity for clothes. And about this condition, there is a text that I pretty much liked. So this is Roberto Calasso, The Book of All Books. Is a book about the the Old Testament, which plays with it in a way which is not, let's say, analytical or too scholar, but makes a kind of novel about the Old Testament. And what Calasso writes, I read here now, he says, when Eve handed him the fruit and Adam ate it, their attention turned to something they had right in front of them. Instead of contemplating the beauty of the tree, Adam and Eve felt as thought the scales have fallen from the image they had of themselves. They knew that they were naked. For the first time, they used their hands to make something. They sewed together fig leaves and covered their loins. So I like to mention these quotes because what Calasso implies is that somehow nakedness did not really exist in paradise. So nakedness started to exist as soon as they eat the fruit from the forbidden tree or from the tree of knowledge. So Adam and Eve somehow were naked, as we would consider, but they were not conscious of being naked and were not, as a matter of fact, in paradise, nakedness is not a category that exists. And perhaps we could say, by extension, that not even truth existed in paradise, because there was no difference between truth and falsehood. Truth is not like nakedness or clothing. It is not something necessary in the condition of paradise. Truth and falsity, like clothing and nakedness, emerges only once Adam and Eve are cast out of paradise. So it only emerge with the acquisition of knowledge. So once they get this fruit and then they are cast out, then necessity arises. This is, I think, an interesting kind of point of view through which to enter to that. So why? Because there seems then to be a bond between knowledge, truth, nakedness, or nakedness and clothing. No, so it's a bit a quantum state. So it's nakedness implied clothing. They're not self-exclusive. So we can only be naked if we know what clothing is. And about this, also still Calasso from the same books writes, nakedness didn't have to do with sex so much as with the incompleteness. They realized their bodies would always be lacking something. For the moment, it was just leafy loincloths, but one day it would be napped filled. Or, in a more distant future, a bow. The prosthesis came as an overcompensation for incompleteness, and was the first knowledge to come down from the forbidden tree. They looked around and saw that none of the animals felt the need to add anything to themselves. They were all complete, and complete they would remain. So here, not only we have this idea of incompleteness and of nakedness as a kind of incompleteness that arises with, let's say, the casting out of paradise, but also we have the comparison between clothing and instruments such as bow and arrow. No, so in a way, it's as if the way we enter into the world, so casted out of paradise and entering the world the world of man or the world of nature. And the way in which we get to know it has to do with the mediation of instruments and clothing that at the same time turn the world into an object of knowing. So it's as if both clothing and instruments stand between us and the world around us. And Calasso calls them literally prostheses that in let's say, prostheses, today we refer to it as, I don't know, my glasses are prostheses, or if you hurt if you cut your arm, you have a prosthesis. But prosthesis, the literal meaning of it is actually what stand in front. So it's yeah, like my glasses, they stand in front of my vision and they allow me to look at you. No? So there is always this kind of reality once we are cast out of paradise. And without them, without the clothing and without the instruments, we are naked. We are exposed to the world and to its violence, to its attacks. That's why also the idea of the bow and the arrow. So clothing and instruments are something that go together with this idea of veiling and unveiling. So they cover us, but at the same time, they reveal things. No, precisely, if you want, like my glasses now. So with this said, perhaps can we see something, for instance, like the microscope or the telescope in this light? So like the prosthesis, like in the same, let's say, domain of clothing and the bow. So in this kind of double movement of nakedness and clothing, or of truth and falsity, so this kind of compresence. And can we see them as giving us, compensating for a certain kind of incompleteness, also, as Calasso was saying, so for a lack of knowledge that we have around the world that surrounds us. So these instruments perhaps make room for truth, so as much as for error. So they kind of cast a space in which room is with truth is welcome as much as mistake and falsity. So in that sense, I want to see this idea of instruments, if you want, as architectonic. So as something that precisely not just affirms or denies, not just that says this is true and this is false, but that opens up a space, opens up a room in which truth and falsity can come. So they can play with each other. A room also in which, if you want, subjects and objects can meet. So where humans can meet the world around them. But about this, then I will be more clear later. And this, if you want, is also something that has to do with architecture at large, in this correspondence, if you want, between the idea of clothing and architecture is also in the idea of, in the correspondence between, if you want, habit, that has to do with clothing, and habitat, the way we inhabit things. So if you want, there is architecture as a form of clothing that is independent from this or that body. So it's as if we blew up our clothes and make a room within the world with it. But here, what matters, and here you see, probably you're familiar with it, is Loger frontispiece for Essai sur l'architecture, where Madame Architecture points to the origin of the orders. But what matters are not really the elements or the order, but the void that these elements cast. So this void that these elements make within nature, and then in which the human can meet nature, truth can meet falsity, etc. So all these things. So let's say what I would like to draw is a line, if you want, between the nakedness of Adam and Eve, the clothing, let's say, of the microscope, and the room that is casted by the first house. And this voice, which I was speaking, if you want, is very much present in the paradise. To come back to it. Because if you think about it, Adam and Eve never had a house, So in the paradise, they had a garden, but they didn't have a house, So how is it so? That not only they didn't need clothing, they didn't need a house, but they had a garden. And this is what Riccardo in this book here, that is a very interesting premise on Adam House in Paradise, affirms. In the first lines, he says, a garden without a house is like a carriage without a horse. And then he says, how is it possible that in the Bible we never read about the house of Adam and Eve? And what he uses to do so is not to just criticize this, but to say that he proposes to investigate the arguments of all these architects that thought about the first house, starting from Loger, for instance, in order to show how the notion of a first house that was right because it was first was invoked by them as a justification. So the first principle of the radical reforms. So in a way is precisely to do that thing that I was trying to do now, no? To look at all the truths that the different architects, no, that wrote books about. The first house must have been like this. So the true house, the original house must have been like this. Well, he says, what if this truth is not this or that? So it's not the one of Loger or Le Corbusier, but what if is an empty space in which many of these models can come and fill this space. So this is, let's say, the line that I wanted to propose with between truth and nakedness in relation to architecture. But then, as I was saying, there was also another element in the story of Andersen, which is the one of the child. No, so the connection between truth and infancy. What is the connection? We can reconstruct it quite easily. There's this cliche, if you want, of the eyes of the child, so that the children see the things for the first time, so they are without prejudice, they are without preconception, so they are a bit like a blank sheet of paper, no? So they are impressed by the things from the first time, so they do not have some kind of knowledge that if you want, is a kind of preconception and obstructs an obstacle and gets in the way of a kind of immediate perception of things. So this is why also in the tale by Andersen, then is only the child to say, but the king is naked, nobody else, because everybody knows that if he would say so, maybe he would be punished by the king. The child doesn't know. And precisely by not knowing, he can see the truth. So it's also, this is interesting. Also, he has no knowledge, and therefore he can see the truth. Following this reasoning, the question that comes following that is that, does this imply that the access to truth is lost once you become adult? So does this imply that we can attain truth only as infant? To a certain extent, yes, we could say yes. But precisely because infancy is a kind of precondition of truth, what is interesting to look at is the notion of study. So the notion in which we look at things to, let's say, get their truth. And in regard to that, I would like to bring in a reference which is particularly fitting for the discourse on truth as an object and on the idea, back to the idea of clothing, with this guy on the right, Emanuele Coccia. He's an Italian philosopher that operates mostly in France. And if you haven't heard from him, he became quite famous today, recently, especially in the field of architecture. He's like a new kind of philosophical star in certain environments, especially related to architecture. Why? Because also architecture is related to another field of design, which is the one of fashion. And this is the guy on the left, who is Alessandro Di Michele, who is the former artistic director of Gucci. So you see fashion, clothing, and philosophy together. They work together. But the reason why I bring Coccia today is because he did his PhD in philosophy on a quite, let's say, established topic, which is Averroes, who is a Andalusian Islamic philosopher. But his PhD was called Transparency of Images, and it was interesting for me precisely also in my PhD to discuss what I was discussing before about this kind of idea, images as what make the transparent opaque, so that what are an obstacle, let's say, to a true vision of the world. But then precisely discussing in the ways I was right now, so in which this kind of veiling of things is what then reveals at the same time. No? So these two things are happening at the same time. And what Coccia does is that it provides a philosophy in which images and the sensible are not precisely not what hides truth, but what dresses it up, and therefore by dressing it up, makes it therefore visible. And so that's why I was saying that truth in that sense can become an object, a property, a bit like a fashion item, so that, let's say, by dressing the body up, the body becomes visible. No? And and in that sense, perhaps we can have truth as a property, like a bit like Ariana Grande was saying. But yeah, but my point was, as I was saying, it was about infancy and study. So what about infancy and study? Is that in his PhD, Kocha is also a part on study, and he has this provocation where he says, it is not reason but study, the power that distinguishes humans from all other beings capable of experience. So what separates and detaches humans from animals, for instance, and from their completeness, as Calasso was saying, so what, let's say, is opened up in the space of incompleteness of the human is the power of study. And study, normally, when we say we study something, we mean that we acquire knowledge. No, if I study this glass, then I start acquiring knowledge of this glass. And this acquisition is what perhaps feels incompleteness. But the provocation of Kocha goes exactly in the opposite direction. So he says study has precisely not to do with acquisition. And he says, for something like study to be possible, knowledge must present itself as a potentiality and possibility, unrelated and separated from the existence of the individual subject, and not as a possession or a belonging, nor as a knowledge already inherently owned. So study is not the acquisition of a knowledge, but it's precisely the relinquishing, or the forgetting, if you want, of everything we know. So we have to kind of make a kind of blank sheet, make a room again, make a void within our minds, make room for something to come as it is and without preconception. So if you want, there is a kind of poverty in study. So if for those of you who might be familiar with, for instance, the work of Walter Benjamin, he writes this very short essay on experience and poverty, where poverty is not negative, but is something, let's say, to praise, because it's precisely this relinquishing of, let's say, on the one hand, of the capitalistic property, and on the other hand, precisely is making a room for absolute potency. And in this essay is quite dear to architects, because then he says the glass house is this model. No? So in the glass house, the glass is not just like a window pane, it's not just like a surface, but it becomes a room. So this transparency is not just a line, if you want, it's not just a screen, but this screen is a room in which that we can inhabit, and we inhabit without, as he says, leaving traces. So in studying, there seems to be this kind of double movement. So in order to acquire, in order to know, acquire knowledge over something, we have to lose, or we have to become poor, we have to spend, we have to relinquish everything. So to spend a bit, in that sense, this is where enough goes with price of truth, and also where one would go with information theory. But so in order to discover and unveil, we have to dress up. So these two things are simultaneous, no? And how does this relate to infancy? What he writes, he says, is the possibility of study is the gift that the condition of being an infant offers to humanity. Every time one studies, the condition of infancy is restored. Every student knows that infancy is not something past and distant, but a condition that must be constantly produced, sustained, and nurtured. In study, a person actively recreates their own infancy. And I wanted to bring the idea of infancy, because what I think is interesting there is that infancy is, let's say, a period of our life that we move on from. Now we're adults, so an infancy comes first and adulthood comes later. So there's a kind of linearity in it. And what this understanding of study as infancy does is precisely question this linearity. You know? So it's as if there is the flowing of time that goes from past to present and then to future. And it's as if something like study kind of creates a whirlwind, a pocket within it, that makes it so that, to a certain extent, is as if times reverse its flow. No? So we go from adulthood to infancy again. So it's a kind of counter movement in time. And we could, for instance, compare this to notions such as one of progress on evolution. No? So now today, especially to, let's say, a kind of, if you want, dominant scientific discourse, the idea is that from modernity on, let's say, we are in a progress. No? So we live better than yesterday, and with Darwin, there is evolution. So there is a kind of speciation. There is a differentiation in species. So things differentiate and branch. And what study introduces is a counter movement to that, so what the mathematicians would call involution. But it does so in a way which is not then a regression, so it's not something where we become more stupid, but actually in which there is a room of indeterminacy and potency that is opened up, no? And perhaps as a scheme, I take here the prism that is on the cover of The Dark Side of the Moon from Pink Floyd, no? So the idea of evolution goes, let's say, from white to color. We have this kind of white beam that hits the prism and then differentiates itself into different colors. And studies as if it does the opposite things. No? So from this kind of different colors, from this kind of richness of things, we become poor again, but this poorness is not a poorness because there's less things, but actually what the prism shows is that the white itself is not less color, it's just all the colors at the same time, no? It's a kind of omnipresence. And this helps me to introduce another notion that I think is useful to look at this kind of mechanics that I'm explaining, which is the one of incandescence. This is from Michel Serres. Incandescence is the idea of a light, so of a light that is incandescent. And what he writes in a book which is called The Incandescent, he says precisely about evolution. He says, as it advances, evolution differentiates. Should it despecialize by erasing boundaries, it seems to go backwards. In progressing, it multiplies colors and shades. In regresses, it seems to turn pale and produce a candidate for incandescence. De-differentiated, forgetful, we became poor. So this is, let's say, what it seems to be, no? But then he says, we discover that this incandescence mixes and potentially contains every color. By losing countless specificity, valencies, or real powers, the zero-valent, nilpotent human became, without meaning, to no doubt, virtually omnivalent, totipotent, global, and infinite. So, in a way, the more we differentiate, the more we study, the more we reach this totipotency and indeterminacy. And here is also interesting that this kind of 0 and 1 are in overlapping to each other, no? In the sense that we reach this kind of infinity, this kind of completion, but we do so precisely by looking or by going towards nothingness. No? So the nothing and everything kind of oscillate in this kind of room. And perhaps truth and falsity again. No? So the more we make room for this potentiality, the more we can move freely, or a bit like in the absence of this house in paradise that can be filled by many theories of how architects started. And here is a way I often like to picture this kind of pocket that I was talking about with study. And also the study, we make a kind of pocket in time and also within the word to look at the word. I think this is a funny example, but very effective from Hans Online. This is the Mobiles Bureau or mobile study. That actually is a place to study, but online gives him this kind of form of a bubble, no, where he studies. So in which, if you want, there is this kind of overlapping of all these things that I was mentioning. So of clothing, so of architecture as a kind of cloth, of also technology, you know, this idea of a bubble, and also of transparency, of being able to look outside while being at the same time protected for it. So it is a room, if you want, in which we can be at the same time naked and covered, in which we can know truth and falsity, but without which, and this is important, without this room, without this architecture, this distinction does not make sense. So truth and falsity, knowledge and ignorance are not there without this room. So this room and this, what I claim, is prior to that distinction. So it's what engenders this distinction. And here, yeah, what I was saying, what I like is that this has to do also with the relation between human and the world, no? So between the human that is protected from the elements of the world, but at the same time exposed to it. In regard to that, I would like perhaps to move to, let's say, a more history of architecture example, and to the example, let's say, that has to do perhaps with truth by excellence and with protection and exposure by excellence, which is the one of the temple. So we move not just in architecture, but in religious architecture, so an architecture that has to do with the idea of truth. And what I propose here is, let's say, a schematic view of the temple. So these are the two plans from one hand, the Parthenon in Athens, and the Pantheon in Rome. And the way I would like to see the temple here is precisely as a boundary between nature, if you want, or the world of things, so not the human world, but the world of things, symbolized in this case by the divine, and the human world. So, if you want, between the real and the rational, to say it with the real. And these two things are divided by this architecture and also put into communication between them. So architecture divides them and puts them into communication. So architecture articulates the order between the two. And it does so, that's why I put the two examples, because it does so in a way which is not fixed, you know? So actually these two examples are completely the inverse to each other. So on the one hand, with the Parthenon, we have a pocket for the divine within the human world. So the divine here is hidden in the cell. So the violence of the word, if you want, the kind of, the divine comes also with this idea that, I don't know, if there is a storm, then the gods are angry at us. So this that would be the truth that comes with this kind of ancient religion. And then, in order to kind of protect ourselves from that, we enshrine the divine, the statue of the god, within the temple. And what the Pantheon does is exactly the opposite, no? So the Pantheon is actually a kind of space for the human. The human is at the center, and the gods are always on the periphery. And we even have this oculus on the top that welcomes precisely the rain and all the meteorological elements. And this is even more striking, if you want, in elevation. So we have this kind of filter of the columns in the case of the Parthenon, and the sphere of the human in the Pantheon. So on the one hand, the goddess is concealed inside. On the other hand, is the human that hides, if you want, inside and looks at the window in itself. And this is also has to do, if you know a bit, the political and urban history of where these architecture are located. So in one hand, we have the polis, so the state, the city-state of Athens, which is something limited, so it's in itself a limited body. So, on the other hand, we have the urbs of Rome, and Rome is not a city, but Rome is an extension of territory. So Rome stops where, let's say, the military of Rome stops. So there is also this kind of inversion in regard to the urban fabric. But yeah, what is interesting here is, I think, that in relation to the notion of truth, is that here we have, of course, the idea of myth, of these mythical figures of the god, and here, if you want, architecture mixes the two. So the two find a kind of meeting place in the walls and in the windows of architecture. So the walls cover the word, but also they allow the presence of a window through which we can look at the word. We could do the same discourse, if you want, on a structural level of these two architectures. So if we consider gravity as a kind of true force, gravity is universal. It's kind of universal truth, if you want, if the gravity exists, and the way these two architecture deal with it is very different ways. On the one hand, we have the trilithic structure that counters gravity, so makes it so that the building stands by the properties of the material. And on the other hand, we have the arc, which works only with geometry and transcends, if you want, materials. But these two are, if you want, imaginary operations, or are things that are artificially placed there. So in that sense, in which nature and artifice is mixed together. One excursus, perhaps, on the idea of classical architecture and classical ornaments that might be interesting to look at truth, has to do with the meaning of the orders and of the ornament. And this book is quite interesting in regard to that. So it's the lost meaning of classical architecture. So in which there's this idea of the meaning of the classical architecture, no? So as something lost, again, something forgotten, concealed. So it's a kind of truth to be revealed. And in that sense, Ursi really looks at it precisely in these terms of aletheia, no? So in terms of unveiling and unforgetting. So, and his point is very simple. He says, normally we say that the Greek temples were the house of the gods, the places where the ritual and sacrifice were celebrated. But he says, yeah, but not just that. Is what he says is that the Greek temples were not just that, but they were the very product of the sacrifice. So the Greek temple is not the place where the sacrifice is performed, but is the product of it. And it's an hypothesis here. You can read the book. I will not go through it, but it's supported by some evidence. For instance, one of them is the fact that columns and the name in which we address columns, so like the capital, seems to correspond to the body or the human body. And for instance, with caryatids, we even have human bodies that act as column. So the idea is that what the Greek temple hides or conceals within itself is precisely the fact that it was made out of the bodies of the sacrificial victims. And the idea that it introduces there is the one of trope, which here I read from a brief excerpt from the text. It says, trope itself, the word and the thing, is linked to a type of sacrifice made in ancient warfare. In Greek, tropos means style, turn, twist, hence the twisting of word. It is also connected to trophy, for trophies were originally erected at the points on the battlefield where the tide turned, etrepse, against the losers. Trophies, that is to say, mannequins formed of the arms, weapon, and helmets of the slain enemy, were set up to appease their shades and to prevent the gods from punishing the victors who had killed them. Their deaths were thus troped from murder into sacrifice. So there's this connection, if you want, between the trophy that here you see in an example and the trope. So in one in which the victim of the defeated party is dismembered and by this way remembered, if you want. So it's kept through this kind of mythical dressing up. So there is a kind of fiction there that intervenes, but this fiction makes it so that something of the victim is remembered. No, so there is again this two coexistence between, if you want, reality and fiction at the same time. So in which one is sculpted by the other, and truth theory is somehow not preserved by exposing it, but by concealing it, precisely through this kind of idea of truth. This has to do with, of course, with the idea of Greek sacrifice, which has to do with also with the dismemberment and remembering of parts, so with the deconstruction and reconstruction of things. So this is also how the temple is understood. And what I think, why I'm mentioning it now, and unfortunately I think today I will not have time to go through this in depth, but we can also discuss it. This is all very timely because this has pretty much to do with things that are very timely today, such as the idea of encryption. No, that is something that has to do with, for instance, how our computer works, and it's something that we can relate also to these very old things. No, so the idea that in order to save something, save some form of knowledge, we have to conceal it in a way, or we have to dismember it in a certain way. So there's this kind of connection, if you want, with the idea of the crypt, so between the burying a body, between hiding a body, and encryption, which makes it so that then we can encrypt things, a message, and then decrypt it, no? So in that sense, we're not anymore in the domain of truth, but we are in the domain of information, no? But it's a domain, the one of information, in which truth and falsity play together, no? So they kind of have a bargain, like a bit like I think Enough goes with his book. And yeah, here again, perhaps the provocation, similarly to the one that I was making with the idea of the fact that the pocket and the architecture pre-exist to the idea of truth and falsity, then information is something that perhaps pre-exist also the true. Huh? So one makes it possible. Good. So what we covered so far were the two things that I promised. So the idea of truth and clothing, and the idea of truth and infancy or study. But then there is one, let's say, an element of the story that was absent or invisible, and that I didn't mention. Because the child that in the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, the child that says the king is naked is not only sees the truth, if you want, but he also speaks the truth. So he pronounces the word, the king is naked. So there's another element which was not apparent there, which was hiding, if you want, and is the one of language, no? And language, in that sense, is even more than architecture, at least in our understanding. So I would say, I would challenge this primacy, but language is the primary vehicle for truth, no? If you want, the Bible is written in a language, then philosophy is written in language. So whenever there has to be something with truth, we always speak the truth, no? So it's something that is pretty much related with it. But then how can we understand language precisely not in these kind of terms of transparency, but in the terms that I just outlined? And here, I think one interesting reference is this book by Michel Serres, The Natural Contract, which is interesting on the one hand because it rethinks the contract beyond the social. So if you know The Social Contract by Rousseau, it's a reference to that, and then it tries to think of this beyond the idea of the social. But it's also interesting because it rethinks nature through a kind of idea of vegetal fetishization. Also, it's a bit beyond this kind of greenwashing that we have today. And it's interesting, so I chose this cover of the main editions because there's not a tree, there's not nature, there's not a universe as in other covers, but there is two guys fighting, no? So it starts with a fight. And the opening pages, the opening chapter is actually called War and Peace, and they describe a conflict. So it's what Serres describes is a conflict between two individuals that are fighting, or they're having an argument. So they're fighting with words, and they are, if you want, war with each other. He writes, suppose there are two speakers determined to contradict each other. As violent as their confrontation might be, as long as they are willing to continue the discussion, they must speak a common language in order for the dialogue to take place. There can't be an argument between two people if one speaks a language the other can't understand. And here you start to see a bit what I was pointing with the invisibility of language, no? So before, the what we couldn't see, no? So here he directly speaks. So if the two speakers would speak, one French and one Romanian, perhaps they would start having a fight with the hands, no? Because this is actually interesting. This is like a bit of in brackets, but I was reading an article time ago on why we are very aggressive with when we are in a car. Because in a car we get very, very angry, if someone cuts the road or something. And the article was saying precisely because the only mean we have to communicate is the honk. So let's say the spectrum of language is reduced extremely. So we get very uneasy with it. So it can quickly escalate with violence. And here Serres is saying something similar, no? As long as these two speakers agree to talk the same language, they can have an argument that is somehow withstanding a kind of contract that is, to a certain degree, peaceful. And this is interesting because he says war and peace. So war is not violence. War is the degree zero of peace, no? Violence is another thing. So war and peace are this kind of, are playing in this room, but war is a kind of degree zero of violence. So war is still a contract. So actually, if you look at the history of war, today is a bit different, but in the history of war, normally when a country moved war to another country, it didn't just do it. It declared war, and then the other. So there was all this kind of diplomacy. Yeah, so it has something to do with that. But here language is this kind of common code in the fight, and the fight is as if presupposes this kind of tacit contract. So both rivals must subscribe to this contract of the language. Another thing that he says is interesting is whenever someone tries to use words that are technical or that maybe the other the other opponent doesn't know, it's a way precisely to escape from this contract, no? So if you want, whenever you have people that are speaking to you in a way in which they know you cannot understand, is a way to precisely make this blur so that they kind of draw from this contract and they can be they can acquire a superior position to you without let's say a fair means of the fight. And what he says then, that what is consequent from this discovery, if you want, is that this diagonal between that he describes between the two rivals is crossed by another. So he says that the two parties to the dispute exchange fair arguments or low down insults along one diagonal, so the A and B, while on the second, sideways or across, most often without the speaker's knowledge, their contractual language fight inch by inch against an ambient noise to preserve its purity. this is a bit the informational paradigm, no? So where you have noise on the one hand, and you have language, no? So and then you have that's where, let's say, this gradient between war and peace can establish itself. So there can be, if you want, different degrees of or different scales of language in that sense. But yeah, so there are these two battles, if you want, the one between the two rivals and the one between language and noise. And if you want, the way we could see it as, in relation to what I was saying before, is that this tacit contract of language, what it does is establish precisely a pocket within noise. So it's this kind of a pocket of Hansel line. No? It's as if language makes a room for a kind of civil discussion within noise, within violence. But the reason why he traces these two diagonals, or the things that these two diagonals or these two lines allow us to see, is that, so on the one hand, there's this battle between rival A, rival B, language and noise, but then there is also these other two different natures, no? So on the one hand, it says, on the one hand, there's a subjective battle, so it's a battle between subjects, it's a social battle, it's one of the social contract. But the other one is an objective battle, because it's not fought by subjects, so it's independent by their subject. So in that sense, it's objective, no? So the one between language and noise. The thing is, what is the difference is that the objective battles, in these objective battles, there's no, these two agencies have no name. They have no legal status. We don't, so they are transparent. No? So it's a bit like before we were seeing like the language was transparent. And this is how it connects then, and how it connects then with what I was saying with the temple, no? So that we have these two words, if you want, the social word or the human word, the word of the humans, and the natural word, the word of things. These two separate things, so subjective violence and objective violence. And these two things used to be, if you want, distant or not really, or their crossing was not really perceived until a certain point. So here I like this painting by Giorgione, The Tempest. No, you have also in painting you have often until a certain point what you have in painting is always subjects. No, and then the landscape is always a background. And I think what is nice of Giorgione is that Giorgione's Tempest is one of the first introductions, if you want, to landscape painting, because yes, you have, this is a crop, by the way, but yes, you have a subject. So you have this mother with a child. But the protagonist is as if is the storm that is coming beyond her, no? And let's say around this period is that when we have the shift in painting where we stop having just subjects and then we have only landscapes. Our eye starts to be on nature, if you want. And so, but until a certain point is, and this painting I think is a pivotal point. The social is as if it happens always on the foreground of the natural, and the natural is always on the background. So the two are somehow separated. But the point that Serres make is that today is not anymore the case. So the two cross with each other, and actively so, and in a way that we can see and touch, no? And Serres is a man, let's say, now he's dead, but he was born more or less at the same time in which the Second World War was fought, and the Second World War, we all know how it ended, with this idea, so with this point of the dropping of the atomic bomb, which is the first point, if you want, in time or in history, in which, for the first time, the war, so this kind of subjective violence that we were talking about, could escalate to a point that could end life on Earth. You know? So if you have seen this movie, what is called Oppenheimer, at some point one of the scientists says, oh, okay, but what if we trigger the bomb and then all the atmospheres blow up and we all die? You know? So this is also, let's say, one of the risk or the points that comes with power such as the nuclear power. You know, that not only we can defeat the adversaries, not only rival A can defeat rival B, but the battle between the two can basically kill everything, can kill both the mother and the storm, so to say, no? So what Serres says is that today is a stake. What is at stake is not this and that person, but Earth in its totality and humanity collectively. So these two things are at stake. So there is a kind of shift of scale, and this is, I think, has to do. It's very nice to read it, for instance, through the words of Rancolas in his essay "Bigness." No, so it's a kind of once architecture reaches a certain scale, it becomes bigness. No, there's a kind of critical mass that is once is reached. changes the quality and the nature of things. And what Serge doesn't speak of bigness, he doesn't read Colas, unfortunately. But what he says is that, for instance, megalopolises are becoming physical variables. So they don't think nor grades, they wait. So the fact that our cities are not just an agglomeration, a social agglomeration of things, they're not just civitas, they're not just a matter of citizenship, but they become things that weigh on the world, no? And this was written in 1995. In 2000, we have the the appearance of this word, the idea of Anthropocene. I guess most of you are probably familiar with this, which precisely indicates this. So the shift of scale in human operation that corresponds to a qualitative shift from living to inanimate. So Anthropocene refers to a geological age, so the geological, so to the kind of geology, so something that has to do with the inanimate par excellence, the stones, which is affected by the activity of the human, no? And Sarah in this book has a very nice phrase that I think summarizes the idea of Anthropocene, even if he didn't know about it or didn't know about the word. He says, global history enters nature and global nature enters history. And he says, this is something utterly new in philosophy. And why I like this phrase is because history and nature, first of all, are not unbound, so history, meaning human history, are not unbound from each other anymore, but one enters into each other, one steps in. So there is a kind of, again, an idea of room, of space, of this kind of pockets, there is a kind of invasion of territory or of room between the two. And this point with the natural contract, he said, what is a natural contract? It's something we need precisely to establish this boundary. And again, this boundary not just as a line, but as I was saying before, like the transparency, as a room in which the coexistence between these two lines, between this subjective violence and objective violence, can be thought. His point, he's not an architect, he's a philosopher, and a philosopher of science to a certain extent. And he says the only agency that has been able to deal with such a contract, and so far, is scientific knowledge. But interesting, not scientific knowledge, not as a kind of logical construction or not as a kind of discovery of truth, but rather precisely what converts laws into facts and vice versa. So precisely as something which plays with truth and arbitrariness in a way in which we were saying before. No? He says scientific knowledge results from the passage that changes a cause into a thing and a thing into a cause, that makes a fact become law and de facto become jure and vice versa. So a kind of science that does not think that the real is rational and that the rational is real, like in Hegel's logic, so that we can read, let's say, the reality or truth directly, but in which these two things, the rational and the real, are of equal power, but we need to make a kind of contract between the two, otherwise they can't coexist. And in which, if you want, following the idea, let's say, of space or of room, in which the real can contain the rational as much as the rational can contain the real. So there is also a kind of idea of container and container in a kind of breath between them. He writes that the reciprocal transformation of cause into thing and law into fact explains the double situation of scientific knowledge, which is on the one hand arbitrary convention, as is all speculative theory, and on the other hand the faithful and exact objectivity that underlies every application. So here you see, scientific knowledge is not something through which we can understand the truth of the world, but it's something that hosts at the same time a kind of objectivity and arbitrariness, or a kind of artificiality, fiction, if you want. How to think of this in architectural terms? This, I think, is a paradigm that I haven't found anything better to compare it with. And if you want, we come back a bit to the beginning, to the idea of the Eden, but not just that, the one of the garden. No? So the garden can perhaps be seen as the lieu of this kind of coexistence, or this border that has a depth. And I take actually this reference. I don't know if you know this architect. This is Office Kersengeers David van Severen. He's an office from Brussels. This is one of the very first projects. It's called Border Crossing, and is the idea of a kind of outpost for crossing the border between USA and Mexico, which is thought precisely as a garden. No? So the idea is that while going from one place to another, one would need to enter this garden and get lost. So in which precisely this boundary between states is not a line, is not this wall, but becomes a place in itself, and not just any place, a place with its own order. And another thing which I think makes this project very meaningful in that context is because it is a border, yes, between the two states, USA and Mexico, but then it's a garden, so it's also a border or a space of encounter actually between human and nature, sky and earth. So it has this kind of more polyvalence. The garden perhaps can be understood or can help us see kind of architectural rendering of what Serre calls the natural contract. So to put, let's say, scientific knowledge and architecture on the same domain. And what I like about the garden as well is that this contract can be articulated in different ways. So it's not just a logical one. There's not just one language, one word. So there are many, no? And if we think, for instance, on one hand, we could have botanical gardens that are made to classify plants, no? Exactly, so by a kind of typology of plants, they're more taxonomical. We can read nature through the different species. But then we also have, for instance, the topiary art in gardens, in which the designer gives nature a form. And this is also another nice thing of the garden is that it's not just a human architecture. Of course, we design gardens, but the garden is a natural contract precisely because it requires nature if you want to step in. So she needs to do the work. So if nature does not collaborate, so to say, the garden does not exist. So it's a kind of impersonal agency which is there, no? And it's not just that it can be built, no? So as any one of you that has had plants knows it, no? So you have to take care of it. You have to, but also there has to be a kind of collaboration. With me, they usually don't collaborate and die, but so that's why probably I speak of gardens. Or again, even so it doesn't need to be a vegetal thing. No, you can have also the Zen garden, in which, if you want, there is a kind of dialogue between human tracing and the traces of time. So here, nature is not nature as trees and forests, but it's time itself. No, so you trace these lines in the garden, and with time they get erased. So there's a kind of almost entropic idea that the Zen garden brings. And yeah, as I was saying before, so this idea of the passage from fact into law that the natural contract was operating, so this kind of contract is not precisely just in the end of the human agency only. So it's also a kind of contract that is enacted by the word of things, by nature. As Serre would say, nature needs to sign the contract as well. And it helps to abstract, if you want, on one hand from anthropocentrism, but it also makes room for an agency which is impersonal. So you could call it nature, it could be chance, it could be divinity. So it's a bit generous in that term, so we don't need to decide. So it's a place, if you want, for truth to reveal itself in this double movement of unveiling and revealing and unclothing, but it's not in a dogmatic way. So a place where truth has rather to be cultivated and preserved, also by recurring to fiction, falsehood, invention, imagination, where the real is shaped by the imaginary, like the truth of the king's nakedness that can only appear through this kind of clothes, and in the crossing between infancy and language. So this would be today my talk. Thank you.